Yeah, I understand that my colleague, Patrice Armand, has given me, if necessary, 10 minutes of his time. So grateful if you can take a note of that. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to spend a lot of time replying to my friend, the previous orator, just to say that his lack of knowledge of decentralized government, principles of government, is only, to my mind, surpassed by his lack of knowledge of reality on the ground, quite clearly demonstrated by the fact that he seems ultra happy to have a regional assembly and at the same time a PPS representing central government on the ground there from his own party. As far as infighting, there may be or may not be, I hope not, in the coalition in Rodrigues, but I mean nothing compared to the present infighting between the minority leader and the PPS, which is very well known in Rodrigues. Mr. Speaker, having said this, my speech will be three-pronged approach. One, I'm going to deal with the undeniable truths about this budget and the Mauritian economy. I have 12 points on this score. And then I'll speak about the grands absents du budget, issues which I believe have been largely omitted. And third, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about the action required for Mauritius to reach high income status, greater prosperity, and happiness. So I will start, Mr. Speaker, on the undeniable truths. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, I was in my constituency in the weekend. I met a couple, both of them work as cleaners for a firm, private sector firm. And this couple have 2 young children. Both are cleaners. And with this budget, as from 1st of July, they will be able to bring home a total of 44,500 rupees a month. Now, maybe if you earn 300,000 rupees a month or so, 600,000 or whatever, you can consider that 44,500 rupees a month is a meager sum, but it is not. By all means that you can calculate, income in Mauritius, disposable income. This amount, 44,500 for a couple that are working, Mr. Speaker, as cleaners, is a substantial amount. Until a few years ago, Mr. Speaker, only middle-ranking cadres, middle-ranking managers could take home this sort of money. Now today, as I mentioned, this is possible for even two small cleaners working for a private firm. But of course, I'll speak later of the threat that inflation poses to their newfound revenues. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, undeniable truth, we have the lowest unemployment figures in a quarter of a century. 6.3% at 31st of December 2023. We are told by the Minister of Finance that it is now 6.1%. But I'd like to say one thing on this. You can achieve low unemployment figures by people withdrawing from the labor force. But it is not the case. If you look at the latest social and economic indicators, in fact, the labor force over 2023 has increased by 30,000 people. So when the labor force increases by 30,000 people, and yet you have a reduction in unemployment, what does it mean? Anyone can tell you that it means that there has been substantial job creation. That is another undeniable truth. And as we know, giving someone a job is probably the greatest gift that you can give to anyone, and that is, therefore, I wanted to point this out. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, something for our youth. Youth unemployment has fallen to an all-time low of 17%. Usually, youth unemployment is around 25%. So we have many more young people working nowadays than they would be working before. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all want to use figures, obviously, to our own advantage. But let's say that we agree that the IMF is a fairly reliable and independent arbiter in all this. Now, the IMF calculate that the per capita income of Mauritians, per capita being the revenue per person in Mauritius, for each person in Mauritius, has increased now to nearly $13,000. That is 51,000 rupees per month. That is figures published by the IMF. Now, the interesting thing is that if you want to reach high income status, which every country aspires to reach high income status, if you want to reach high income status, well, the threshold, the minimum threshold for high income status is 54,000 rupees. So we're in fact not far at all. This country is not far at all from reaching high income status. It is 13,845 US dollars against 12,997 US dollars per annum, which translates to, in rupees, to the figure that I have given to you. But we all know that it is extremely hard to get from a middle income status country to a high income status country, and I'll come to that in a moment. Because not only do you want to get there, but you need to stay as a high income country. Mr. Speaker, now the fifth point concerns growth of 7% in 2023, which is extremely respectable. IMF calculates growth at 4.9% for 2024. The Minister of Finance for financial year 24-25 has a higher figure. And this again, Mr. Speaker, is extremely respectable. Mr. Speaker, all these are figures. Well, what about what we see on the ground? I'll give you an example of why I think that, Mr. Speaker, there is prosperity in the country. And I'll give you another undeniable figure. Mr. Speaker, I looked at the registration of new cars, of new vehicles in 2023. In Mauritius, 29,862 vehicles were newly registered. These are new and imported second-hand in Mauritius. 29,862. Of these, 11,500 were new cars, compared to only 7,100 in 2014. So there has been an increase in new car registration of 65% in those years. 65% increase. 11,500 new cars, 2023, compared to 7,000 in 2014. Mr. Speaker, so far as public sector debt is concerned, now we all know that debt is never an absolute figure. It doesn't mean anything to quote what is the debt in rupees. It is always a percentage of the GDP. When you go to a bank and you look for a loan, the first thing that the banker will ask you is, what is your revenue? Once they know what is your revenue, they'll tell you, well, this is how much money I can lend you. Debt is always a function of your revenue, nothing else. If I borrow $1 million, it's a lot of money for me. If Bill Gates borrows $1 million, it's not even peanuts for him. It's less than peanuts. So it is always a question of a percentage. And here, we are told that the debt burden, whatever it may be in rupees, is in fact 74% of GDP. It is higher than usual. It is higher than usual, especially if you take into account the 158 billion rupees that the government has taken from the Bank of Mauritius. It is, and Mr. Speaker, I think this is something that needs to be carefully monitored, very carefully monitored in view of the expenditure that is being incurred by government. So we need to watch wastage, we need to watch expenditure on non-productive investments, and we need to ensure that growth is there. Mr. Speaker, another point is the undeniable support given in this budget, one to planters and second to fishermen. And that is across the board. Now, I live by the sea, and I have said before in this House that I feel for the fishermen who have to go out and fish in all weather, especially with this climate change. And I'm extremely happy that the bad weather allowance has been increased to 800 rupees per day. Just think of it, 800 rupees per day, bad weather allowance. That's an excellent, it's a substantial amount of money. And I hope that, I'm not looking for claps. But I hope, Mr. Speaker, living in Grand Gobe, that we'll find things to do also for these fishermen, that they don't stay idle at home, that they are given an opportunity to earn further income by being occupied during that time. Mr. Speaker, on Rodrigues, a new airport at 7 billion rupees, 900 million rupees for water and electricity supply, amongst others. That is a desalination plant of 540 million at Pointe Coton. These are major expenditure on Rodrigues. The main objective, the main vision of any Rodrigues government must be to make Rodrigues autonomous economically. That is, they should never put themselves in a position of having to come every year to see the current Minister of Finance, who is nodding, or myself when I was there before, whoever else, to say, let's have money for this and that project. We, Mr. Speaker, in the PMSD, we want Rodrigues to be economically autonomous. That will give a huge range of possibilities, much better life to the Rodriguans, Mr. Speaker. This is all I wanted to say on Rodrigues. And finally, on the 11th point, Mr. Speaker, which I wanted to highlight, is animal welfare. We're all so saddened to see the stray dogs everywhere. Not only are they a social hazard, they are a health hazard, and they're obviously an economic hazard so far as our beaches are concerned. And I welcome these 2 mobile vet clinics that will come. I hope that these clinics will come quickly so that we can start sterilizing the dogs, Mr. Speaker. And cats also, cats also are a big issue. Mr. Speaker, and I move to, this is no doubt what I would call a social transfer budget. There's a few things here and there, but the great bulk of this budget concerns social transfers. Monies that are being taken from the consolidated fund and given to various people. It's very targeted. You know, it has taken a lot of imagination, I presume, to have so much targeting. Various types of groups are targeted, the vulnerable groups. Hats off for the young cancer patients. That's a good example. Mr. Speaker, another group that's been targeted are the numerically strong groups, where there are lots of people, the pensioners. These are groups that have been targeted against in this budget. And then also, a bit more surprisingly, the influential groups. Now, big increases for social, cultural organizations. Okay, fine, it's great. Duty-free for priests, and also the taxi drivers who come every 5 years. You hear of taxi drivers in the National Assembly as the elections come up. So these, Mr. Speaker, social transfer budget targeting various groups in our population. But all these social transfer targeting, Mr. Speaker, all are potentially threatened by inflation, all of it. And the rise in inflation, Mr. Speaker, is a threat to everything, all the goodies that this budget has promised to everyone. Because as we know, this budget is injecting a large amount of money into the economy, and this large amount of money in the economy will, in fact, increase consumption. When you increase consumption, you increase imports. When you increase imports, you put greater pressure on the rupee, and when you put greater pressure on the rupee devaluates. And this is, in fact, the vicious circle that needs to be avoided by this government and the next government, Mr. Speaker. So basically, we have imported inflation with a constantly depreciating rupee, meaning a constantly appreciating US dollar. Basically, and in euros also, but let's stick to the US dollar and the euros. Mr. Speaker, one thing to ask ourselves is there a shortage of dollars in the country? Do we have a shortage of dollars in the country? So I went back to the annual report of the Bank of Mauritius, which is published in December 2023. And I'll give you a figure which might surprise you. The foreign currency held by local Mauritian banks on 31st December 2023 was equivalent to 1.1 trillion rupees. That's 1,000 billion rupees held by Mauritian banks in foreign currency. Of that 1.1 trillion rupees, 900 billion was held in US dollars and 100 billion held in euros and the rest in sterling, etc. So we're talking about 1.1 trillion, 1,000 billion rupees held in foreign currency in Mauritian banks. This is official. You can check it. It's table 26 of the Bank of Mauritius. Now, this compares to how much in 2014? It compares to 431 billion in 2014. So how come, ask yourself, how come there's so much money in the banks in foreign currency and yet such a great shortage on the market when you actually want to get some funds? I think, Mr. Speaker, that this is also the fault of government. First, I must say that 1.1 trillion rupees, it's not all local companies. A lot of it consists of global business companies and the like that hold these currency balances. But nevertheless, that is a huge amount of money. And Mr. Speaker, I think here, I think the fault lies with the government, because the attitude of the government being unclear as to the exchange rate policy, giving the impression that they actually enjoy the rupee depreciating because that creates additional revenue for the Ministry of Finance, that reduces automatically any debt that is denominated in rupees. So as I said last time in my budget speech, I'll say the same thing again. Inflation is the best friend of any Minister of Finance. But it is also the worst enemy of many sections of the population, those that are not exporting. So, Mr. Speaker, what is to be done? Is government going to tolerate continued depreciation of the rupee, accelerating inflation, or is government going to put a stop to the depreciation of the rupee? Now, it's very simple, believe it or not, to put a stop to the depreciation of the rupee because the fundamentals are okay. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is that the government tends to give the impression that they favor a depreciating rupee for economic and budgetary purposes. Singapore is a good case in point concerning exchange rate management. Now, most countries in the world have a monetary policy based on interest rates. They set the interest rates and they allow the monetary policy, the exchange rate to fluctuate. Singapore, being very much like Mauritius, very much bigger, but very similar to Mauritius, has adopted a monetary policy based on exchange rates. It says every 6 months what it wants the exchange rate with the dollar, for instance, to be. Once it says what is the exchange rate that is to be expected, there is no speculation. In fact, Mr. Speaker, people in Mauritius keep money in foreign currency because, they are quite right to do so, because they imagine, they expect the dollar or the euro to increase in value, and therefore it is a good economic practice. Nobody can blame them. They keep their assets in euros or in dollars. But if the government wants to stop speculation, I'm not sure it does, but if it does want to stop speculation on the rupee, it has to come up with a clear exchange rate policy by an independent Bank of Mauritius, supported verbally at least by the Ministry of Finance and the government. That is so simple to do, yet so difficult it seems to achieve. Mr. Speaker, we have had last year inflation rate of 7%. What was the inflation rate in Seychelles? Very comparable to us, 0.5%, not even 1% in Seychelles. What was the inflation rate of Maldives? Also, I haven't taken USA, Europe. What was the inflation rate of Maldives? 3%, less than half of what the inflation rate in Mauritius. So with due respect, whatever ministers have been saying, it's inflation, is imported from Ukraine. God knows we don't buy gas from Ukraine. It's inflation from Ukraine, this, that, the other. It doesn't hold water. It doesn't, there's no logic in what is being said. It doesn't make sense. Because countries very similar to us, who have been able to manage their currencies and keep their currencies stable, have had low inflation. And we know the damage that inflation has caused to people and will cause to all these social transfers which are being made to all these targeted groups. So this, Mr. Speaker, the policy tool exists. We need to, like in so many things, we need to copy Singapore, and this is perhaps in one sentence. In one sentence, the trade-weighted exchange rate in Singapore is allowed to fluctuate within a policy band, the level and scope of which are announced semi-annually to the market, Mr. Speaker. When talking about inflation, quite rightly in this House, myself and the just previous leader of the opposition raised the issue of parallel imports. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we should allow parallel imports. There are conflicting views on how this will work in the economy. There's only one way to sort it out. Let's take 100 products, allow parallel imports for these 100 products. After 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, we will know whether the effect is positive or negative, what is the effect. Mr. Speaker, I'm sad to see that this budget doesn't do that, because we cannot forever talk about financial parallel imports and never act on it. There's only one way to act on it, is to act partially. Let's see what happens, and then extend it. And I, Mr. Speaker, say that we need to be very careful on parallel imports of medicine, because medicine are swallowed, or put, basically, it can be dangerous. Counterfeiting can be dangerous. The laboratories in Mauritius are not sufficiently equipped to deal with that. So we would need to sort out our laboratories first for testing, and then allow importation of medicine. That is, unless we're talking about over-the-counter medicine, cough syrup, etc., which are probably less dangerous. So, Mr. Speaker, parallel import will be a proof whether the government wants to have consumers get value for money or not, and there's no reason why we cannot say start with 100 items of goods and see how effective parallel imports is, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of medicine, as I'm on that, it's high time, Mr. Speaker, that doctors can prescribe alternative generic medicine. This must be some sort of legislation, must, Mr. Speaker, be enacted to ask doctors to provide a choice. For instance, the brand name and the generic name, so that someone who cannot afford who can ill afford the actual brand name can opt, if he or she wishes, for the generic name, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many things have been left out of the budget, because I presume that the elections are not far, and the Minister of Finance has not wanted to waste his time, or waste the time of the House, leaving it to the next government to deal with it. But nevertheless, they need to be taken into account. We talked about inflation. Mr. Speaker, we need to talk about drugs. We need to talk about the proliferation of drugs. I've been around the country, and I've talked to so many people. And you know, the first issue, when we were preparing the Women's Congress, the first issue that women talked to me about was not domestic violence, I would have expected, or something like that, was drugs. They are terrified for their children. They are terrified. The word is not too strong. They're terrified for their husbands and maybe for themselves too. Drugs is a huge, huge social problem in Mauritius, and it hasn't been dealt with adequately in this budget, Mr. Speaker. Had hardly ever even been mentioned. Now we have the excellent report of the committee, the Commission on Drug Abuse by Lam Sham Ning. Forget the exact name. Now, we all know that when you have recommendations, you can apply it with vigor, with energy, or you can just apply it like that, just to tick the box. And the feeling is that many of the applications the recommendations of the Commission have just been, the boxes have been ticked without vigor. I'll take one example. The Commission has asked that people who just consume ganja, or just are found with small possessions of ganja, are actually, rather than being prosecuted, they are taken to this drug users panel, the drug users panel, so that they are being given instead rehabilitation. The Minister of Finance himself gave us the figure, 25,000 arrests made in the last few years. Out of this, he proudly tells us that only 46 have been sent to the drug users panel. That is, obviously gives you an idea of exactly what I mean. That is, you can tick the box for the recommendations, but you don't actually implement it as you should. You cannot, and the report of Lam Sham Ning dates back 6 years. You cannot say that you've just applied this recommendation, but you have only put 46 cases. It's called the Drug Users Administrative Panel. Only 46 cases so far have been dealt with by the drug users. There's obviously something wrong. And that the recommendation was made 6 years ago. Again, Mr. Speaker, on the drug issue, we need to sort out an adequate number of state-of-the-art rehabilitation centers. We need to fast-track drug barons going and being dealt with by the courts. There was a PNQ which I myself asked, and I think out of so many hundred cases, only a few of them had actually been dealt with by the courts or even taken to court. Now we saw Mr. Franklin. He left a few weeks ago, God knows, a few months ago, and he's already been sentenced in Réunion Island to 6 years. Fast justice. Here, it will take you years and years and years. There is something wrong that has to be dealt with in terms of our sentencing, of our prosecuting and sentencing drug barons, especially. I'm talking about the big boys that do not get do not get prosecuted, do not get sentenced, Mr. Speaker. Now, only a few of them ever do. Now, there is a case for a special prosecuting unit, both at the level of the police and at the level of the DPP, because you need, obviously, specialized people who will want to process these cases. And why not a special drugs court to fast-track drug cases? We cannot just accept that next door to us, they are not superhumans, people in Réunion, they're people like us. How can they be able to sentence people to long terms in prison within weeks, and we take 10 years? Something is wrong. Needs to be dealt with, Mr. Speaker. Also, the forensic science laboratory, whether it is ill-equipped and willing, I don't know. It takes a lot of time to deal with drug cases. So there's obviously ways that other countries have found to deal swiftly and effectively with drug barons. And this, Mr. Speaker, for whatever reason it is not the case in Mauritius. That is, I'm in fact understating it rather than overstating. This is, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the case. Moving out from drugs, there's a climate change. Now we are in Port Louis. Now it's not raining, thank God. If it were raining, we would have rivers flowing down our streets in Mauritius. Rivers. I have no doubt the minister concerned is doing his best, but this is not, maybe here the best is not good enough. When we had landslides in Mauritius, at La Butte, I think it was Sandro Jagnat was Prime Minister, I think at the time, the government asked for the help of Japanese experts. The Japanese came, they did what they had to do, and we never had a landslide again at La Butte. Never. And I tell you, landslides are far more complicated to deal with than just rain falling down a drain, coming along a drain. Mr. Speaker, what we require, what this country requires, what the people are begging for are solutions to the flooding in Port Louis, in my constituency, in Quatre-Bornes, flooding caused by Metro Express, we all know that. We need foreign experts, foreign consultants, foreign firms to come and help us. We cannot afford to have Port Louis going like this, continue to go like this. It's not possible. It's not acceptable. No one can accept it. And therefore, one can only be sad to see that this hasn't been given the importance that I believe it has in the population. The Speaker, coming now to education. Minister of Education is not there. It's okay. I understand she has a lot of work. But how can you accept a program? How can this government accept a program called the extended program? 3,000 or so children joining that program every year, upwards of 90% fail that same program after 3, 4, 5 years. 5 years, I think it is. No, it's 4 years. It used to be 5 years because of COVID. How can that be accepted? In which country would you accept that? 3,100 people, children, take the exam, 70 pass, 3,030 fail. And and that's not even calculating the people who actually drop out during the years at school, in that program. It's horrendous, Mr. Speaker. It has to be dealt with. It's not a political issue. It's a human issue. It's a human resources issue. These children are entitled to have a good education. They're entitled to have a certificate. They fail the PESAC, they fail the NCE, and what do? They've just been branded failures all their lives. That is not acceptable. I'm speaking on behalf of the children. There are about 15,000 probably in the schools at the moment as I speak. It's not acceptable. It has to be dealt with, Mr. Speaker. And also, how can you ask people who have failed PESAC to take 2 foreign languages as compulsory pass subjects for NICE? They probably speak Creole, they might speak Bhojpuri, I don't know, but they are forced to, so that they can succeed in the PESAC, in the NICE exam, they are forced to know English well, and they're forced to know French well. I would accept that to be responsible citizens, they might have to master one of the 2. Even in UK, you don't have to pass compulsorily in French. In Mauritius, you are asked to do 2 foreign languages if you have PESAC failure. English and French as compulsory. That is horrendous. How can you expect people who failed to be able to master 2 foreign languages? Is that even relevant? Is that even productive? Should you not be telling them to do something more useful in their lives than learn both English and French? Just one. Either English or French, I would be happy with. Anyway, I don't want to get too excited on this subject, but I'm speaking from the heart, Mr. Speaker. Now, on the 5 credits issue, there's a step in the right direction. They are now going to be free of charge. They'll probably save about 15,000 rupees or 20,000 rupees of exam fees when they take it again. We still think, Mr. Speaker, that we should come to the free credits as a much fairer deal for disadvantaged families, because they cannot afford to even on the receipt, they cannot afford to pay for the private tuition that is required in all these 5 subjects. This is something, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be dealt with. As far as the schools funded by the PSEA, there's an attempt by the minister to sort out a very unfair situation as far as funding of private schools by the government is concerned. But we are not there yet. It has to be worked out much fairer, because people who have educational establishments, they may be passionate about it, but it is also their livelihood. It is also, in a way, their business. And they must not be expropriated. They must be given the chance to make a decent return from their schools, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, coming quickly to the Champ de Mars, well, I think we all can see, I mean, if you don't believe me, just go there. Champ de Mars is a bidonville, Mr. Speaker. It's nothing more than a bidonville at the moment. It's disgusting. That's all I can say about it. And it's high time that this be returned to the Mauritius Turf Club and that we get, again, some pride in our races. And that's all I needed to say about that. Mr. Speaker, I talk about CSR. I'm a proponent of returning CSR to what it was under myself and Lakshmi Naraidu, particularly. But I must say that the triple deduction given by the Minister of Finance, it's again a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction that you can deduct from your taxes, from your chargeable income, any money you spend on poverty alleviation, drug abuse, gender-based violence. What that means is that the government will in fact fund 57% of your expenditure. So you spend 100,000 rupees, in fact, government will deduct 57,000 rupees from your tax bill. That's not bad, but it could be better, and I hope that we come back one day to the CSR, Mr. Speaker. As regards tourism, more money to MTPA, whatever it is, that's not the point. The point is, how do we get the product to improve substantially? How do we get the product to become a world product? We all like to go to Singapore, we go to Sentosa Island, whatever it is. Where is our Sentosa Island? Where are you have tourism infrastructure that will actually attract tourists? And this is why I said before, Mr. Speaker, government needs to invest in these tourist villages with central government, local government, the police, everybody on board, the local businessmen also, everybody on board, so that we have places where tourists just love to go, where it is safe, where it is clean, where it is enjoyable, where there is good food, where there is decent nightlife. That is what it needs to be created in any tourism industry. You cannot just give money for promotion. Like this, it's like I have a car with no tires, and I say, okay, I want to sell it, I'm going to spend money, just put it on the newspaper. It doesn't work. You need to have a proper product, then you don't need so much of promotion. You don't need so much of promotion. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hope that happens, because it's important that our tourists have an enjoyable time. We have 1.3 million tourists. Each one of them had an enjoyable time and went back and told 2 or 3 of their friends that they had a great time in Mauritius. We could close the MTPA. We wouldn't need it, because we're a mature tourism destination. But I won't go, because I'm going to run out of time. Road accidents, Mr. Speaker. What are we going to do about these bikes that run around like crazy bikes around in Mauritius? They have no number plates, most of them, many of them. Many of these people don't have licenses. Often they don't run with their lights on, even in Port Louis. And the police just sit there. They'll stop the poor guy in his car. They will not go after these guys because it's difficult. We need, Mr. Speaker, a specialized police effort to control the sort of hooligans today that are using these bikes without licenses, without number plates, without lights all over the island. And this is where criminality starts, when you do not take care of these relatively small issues, Mr. Speaker. And you will continue to get road accidents if this doesn't stop. And the other thing, Mr. Speaker, have you ever seen a country which is as populous as Mauritius with no pavements for the people to walk on? So many cars, so many roads, So many flyovers, not a word on pavements. Not everybody has a car. There are lots of cars, but not everybody has a car. Most people do not have a car. And they have to walk. Children have to walk to school. Ladies have to walk to work. And so many accidents of people being knocked over by cars. Because there are no pavements, that's the only reason that it's so. It's time to stop this madness. It's time to stop, and we need to look again at our road policy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I got a few minutes left, and I'm going to talk about high income status. Why do we want to have high income? Because we want to be able to fund better healthcare, better education, better lifestyle, better leisure, better everything, hopefully. And the IMF have gone to the trouble of telling us what's to be done. And I said, I can see that it's not in this budget, but let's hope that, nevertheless, government has taken note of what the IMF has also. IMF has said, okay, we will not reach high income status if we don't do structural reforms. Now, I think the minister once said, well, what are structural reforms? Structural reforms are deep reforms of the structure of the economy. That is what structural reforms are concerned. That's it. You just look it up. Structural reforms are important, deep reforms to the economy. Well, the first reform, Mr. Speaker, is training to upgrade the skills of our workforce. Because a workforce that is highly skilled is a productive workforce. A productive workforce is a workforce that creates wealth. So, Mr. Speaker, it's important use of IT. So many Mauritians, ordinary workers, cannot use IT, cannot send an email, cannot do a web search. It affects them in their work. Even driving licenses. Driving licenses are essential for workers to be able to be productive. Because then you don't need to have a driver and an employee. You just have the one to do both jobs. Driving licenses, literacy and numeracy, Mr. Speaker. These are things that are required, basic things to increase, upgrade skills. Mr. Speaker, quite rightly, the IMF wants us to strengthen governance and strengthen the anti-corruption framework. They want us, Mr. Speaker, to foster digitalization. I pronounced it right this time. Now, why? Why do they want us to be digital? Because they want the lives of our citizens to be facilitated. You don't have to drive from Mayberg to Port Louis to do anything. You just go on the internet and you get it done. Business facilitation also. Huge, it has started a little bit. Only MRA. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's up to you which side of the coin you want to look at. But only the MRA has got a decent digitalization policy. That's the truth. So, Mr. Speaker, if you want to improve lives, foster much greater efficiency, reduce even traffic because people will not be taking their cars to physically go somewhere. Improve education, all these rainy days. And you hear that government schools are lacking behind in actually giving digital lessons, Mr. Speaker. So, this is what the IMF want to do. The IMF wants us to increase women labor force participation. Now, I had a look why they say that. Mr. Speaker, labor force participation in Mauritius is around 40%, a little bit more than 40% of this is called the female activity rate. Do you know what the female activity rate, labor force participation is in the UK? 72%. 72%. Much, much more than in Mauritius. There may be many reasons for that. One reason is that women find it more difficult in Mauritius to get work than men. They take about 50% more time to get employed than men. But there may be other reasons, and this must be studied, including working from home, because that is an asset, the human resource asset. And remember, often women are more educated than men, have better qualifications than men, and there's no reason, Mr. Speaker, why such an investment in human resources should be staying for the majority at home and not joining the labor force, Mr. Speaker. One last thing. They want us to build resilience to climate shocks. That is a national priority because it's a fact that Mauritius remains extremely vulnerable to climate change. Mr. Speaker, I've come to the end of my speech. For once, I got it about right, the timing. And so I thank you for your attention. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, of all this is to try, each one of us, putting our own effort to make of Mauritius a better country to live in, a more prosperous country, a fairer country, and in short, a happier nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.